Linda Polman, The Crisis Caravan, What's Wrong with Humanitarian Aid? In The Crisis Caravan, What's Wrong with Humanitarian Aid? Linda Polman sheds light on the flaws and failings of modern humanitarian aid organizations. The book reveals how underlying commercial motives have led to aid organizations leaning away from the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. By presenting accounts of aid operations in various crisis hotspots, such as Rwanda, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka, Polman highlights the issues of abuse, deceit, and increasing demand for funding in the humanitarian aid sector. This summary will delve into the reasons behind these problems, the consequences suffered by crisis victims, and the discussions around possible improvements in the aid system.
Aid organizations losing principles. The first humanitarian aid organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, pioneered and upheld the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. However, modern humanitarian aid organizations often fail to maintain these core values. A significant example is the Rwandan genocide in 1994 when thousands of Hutus fled to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. With over 250 aid organizations, including UN groups, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, Oxfam, and others providing support in refugee camps, these camps became strategic centers for armed Hutu forces to carry out further killings of Tutsis. The extremist Hutu government persisted in genocide while aid organizations failed to maintain neutrality, effectively siding with the Hutus. The root of this erosion in principles is the commercialization of humanitarian organizations, which now compete for donor contracts and incur massive costs while trying to recoup their investments, leading to a disregard for humanitarian principles in favor of funding. The dark side of humanitarian aid. While the purpose of humanitarian aid is to alleviate suffering, it can sometimes unintentionally cause harm. Warring factions may exploit aid efforts, as was the case with aid organizations negotiating with the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka and facing armed roadblocks in the former Yugoslavia. Additionally, refugee camps can become hiding places for refugee warriors, who use innocent civilians as human shields, making up as much as 15 to 20% of the camp population, and transforming these safe havens into strategic combat zones. This darker aspect of humanitarian aid highlights the urgent need for improvement in delivering help to conflicted areas. Humanitarian aid is meant to relieve suffering and improve lives. Unfortunately, there are instances when it falls short, even making situations worse. One of the challenges faced by aid providers occurs in conflict zones, where their efforts are sometimes exploited by opposing forces. Take the 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka as an example. Aid organizations were unable to provide reconstruction assistance without negotiating with the Tamil Tigers, a guerrilla group seeking independence. This group taxed every shipment of building materials, resulting in a 25% increase in costs and inadvertently funding their operations. Similarly, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, encountered problems during the 1990s Yugoslav wars. Armed forces set up roadblocks, forcing the agency to surrender a portion of their aid supplies. Another troubling issue arises with refugee warriors, combatants hiding in refugee camps. These individuals regroup and reorganize within the camp while using defenseless civilians as shields. Studies estimate that refugee warriors comprise 15 to 20% of the global refugee camp population. Sudanese rebels, for example, described civilian refugees as aid bait, a means to obtain more humanitarian aid while launching attacks against their government from camps in Ethiopia. In the end, this only increases danger for the civilians seeking safety within the camps. The unfair aid lottery. Wealthy nations and aid organizations often treat the provision of assistance to impoverished communities as a favor, not an obligation. This creates an unfair lottery of aid distribution, with resources directed only toward highly visible or attractive crises. As a result, countries in dire need must engage in public relations battles to secure vital support. In 2004, Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, urged richer member states to contribute more toward the world's poorest nations, arguing for their right to receive aid. However, in reality, aid was treated as a privilege rather than a basic duty. This meant that organizations could willingly ignore crises, allocating resources based on their self-interests. Case in point, the Rwandan genocide saw the Tutsis receiving minimal humanitarian aid while resources flowed to the Hutus in Goma and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This selective indifference is all too common, with aid organizations' focus determined by cost-benefit analyses. Jan Egeland, a Norwegian diplomat, compared it to a lottery, one in which equally desperate groups compete, but only the most visible emerge victorious. Hence, countries in crisis are compelled to wage public relations wars to garner international attention and support, as evidenced by the press officers employed to highlight the plight of citizens in Palestine. The dark side of aid organizations. Aid organizations rely on media attention to draw donors, but this can lead to questionable tactics. For instance, during the Rwandan genocide, these organizations exaggerated cholera death tolls in a refugee camp, fueling a competition among them to secure the highest count. Additionally, some deaths were falsely attributed to cholera when they resulted from violence. To ensure the media coverage they need, aid organizations often embed journalists in their missions, providing them with free flights, interpreters, and chauffeurs. This not only attracts donations but also creates a potentially biased relationship between journalists and the organizations they cover. Unqualified aid, a growing problem. One might assume that humanitarian aid workers excel in navigating crisis zones, but unfortunately, this is not always true. An increasing number of unqualified amateurs, known as Mongos, my own NGO, are establishing their own relief organizations. While they aim to provide quicker and cost-effective aid while bypassing traditional NGO bureaucracy, they often wind up worsening the situation. They are also prone to making mistakes, such as in Afghanistan where religious American Mongos distributed Bibles with food, causing tensions with the Islamic government. Large aid organizations fund these Mongos and likely turn a blind eye to their blunders, fearing that criticism reflects poorly on them. Victims of such unqualified aid, like child amputees in Sierra Leone who were unnecessarily relocated to the US and Germany for treatment, lack proper protection against these interventions, as no laws regulate the quality of humanitarian assistance. Fault lines in Afghan aid. The grave failure of humanitarian aid projects in Afghanistan can be attributed to multiple factors, such as the ineffective intermediary-based system, lack of proper supervision, and the blurred line between aid work and military strategy. As a result, aid efforts repeatedly fell short of their intended goals, exemplifying the need for improved aid strategies in conflicted regions. When examining Afghanistan, one cannot help but notice the glaring inadequacy of the humanitarian aid initiatives despite substantial investment. This failure can be traced back to the reliance on intermediaries in project management. A staggering 4 to 7 intermediaries are often utilized in a typical aid project, leaving funds diminished from multiple parties claiming a share. Take, for example, a road construction project funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, which allocated $15 million for its completion. However, after passing through 3 organizations and accompanying cuts in funds, the final product was a subpar tarmac, falling way below expectations. Moreover, a concerning lack of supervision allows the mismanagement of projects to continue. This issue stems from the need to protect aid initiatives from groups like the Taliban. Thus, organization headquarters are often concealed, and on-site project evaluations are rare, resulting in zero opportunities to rectify misspent funds. Apart from the mismanagement of funds and projects, another complication lies in the distorted boundary between aid and military operations. European countries and the United States often expect humanitarian aid groups to double as force multipliers, aligning their support with the Western military agenda. This politicization of aid causes adversaries like the Taliban to perceive aid organizations as enemies. Consequently, the Taliban target aid projects, forcing groups to seek protection from military forces and further entangling the connection between aid and military efforts. To break this vicious cycle, it is essential to reform aid strategies by promoting transparency in funding management and distancing humanitarian aid initiatives from political and military affiliations. Rethinking humanitarian aid. We must reassess our understanding of humanitarian aid in order to improve its effectiveness. It's time to question the principle of giving aid at any cost, as it can potentially lead to complicity and controversy, such as the Red Cross involvement during World War II. The core values of humanitarian work need to be re-examined to ensure that successful aid missions outweigh the harm they may cause. Increasing transparency and accountability within aid organizations will further enhance their performance, while journalists should maintain neutrality to support authentic improvement in this vital field. Humanitarian aid has faced its share of controversies, revealing the need for a fundamental shift in our understanding of it. To begin this change, we must challenge the principle of providing assistance regardless of the circumstances. This mentality has caused significant ethical dilemmas in the past, including the Red Cross' tragic cooperation with Nazi Germany during World War II. By adhering to neutrality and impartiality, the Red Cross opted for silence despite being aware of the Holocaust, a mistake that has occurred in different ways since then. To avoid repeating these errors, it's crucial to scrutinize the core values underpinning humanitarian work. We must analyze the success and outcomes of previous aid missions, and ensure that the help provided does more good than harm. Assessing humanitarian aid more carefully is essential for improvement. Transparency is another key element in elevating humanitarian work. Although aid organizations often commit to learning and improving with each new project, we need a reliable way to verify their progress. In 1997, the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance in Humanitarian Action, ALNAP, was founded to address this concern. Unfortunately, after 11 years, ALNAP concluded that no coherent method for evaluating performance had been established in humanitarian aid work. To hold aid organizations accountable, journalists play a crucial role. By remaining neutral and avoiding incentives from organizations, they can help foster genuine advancements in humanitarian aid. It's clear that we must be diligent in scrutinizing humanitarian efforts, as improvement starts with a willingness to examine and evolve them.
Linda Polman's The Crisis Caravan unearths the hidden flaws and unfortunate consequences of humanitarian aid in today's world. From commercialization and competitive funding to inadequate accountability and transparency, aid organizations have drifted far away from their founding principles. Analyzing cases from around the globe, Polman examines the connection between humanitarian aid, warring factions, and media manipulation, while suggesting a re-evaluation of the core values of humanitarian work. The book calls for increased scrutiny, assessment, and accountability in the humanitarian sector, urging for a reformation that would make aid a more effective and ethically driven instrument for alleviating human suffering.